Okay, what's up, everybody? My name is Colin LeBeau, and I am here with some of my colleagues from Foxhire, Matt Robinson and John Lindesmith. This is our first podcast, so we don't even have a name for it yet. We're just winging it a little bit. But we know we have a lot to talk about, especially for staffing and recruiting, EORs, employers of record, PEOs, entrepreneurs, startups, big companies. Everybody struggles with employment. And so we thought we'd build a podcast centered around recruiting, staffing, employment, all of the nitty gritty stuff, the cool new up and coming stuff, and just provide our feedback on what we're seeing in the market. We have a really unique position because we're sort of straddling traditional employment, contingent employment, staffing, recruiting, technology. There's sort of a lot of that we're playing with in our space. And so thought we could have a conversation around that every week and hope it's valuable for you guys. So the first podcast that we've had, figured the best place to start is, what is an employer of record? It's what we do, but it's also a term that a lot of people don't really understand or even know exists, to be honest. And so we thought we could dive into like the history of it, what it is, why it's valuable, the differences, some of the confusion that exists in the market, and just address all that stuff because I think a lot of people would have interest in that. So I thought I could kick the first question off to our newest associate in tenure because he was the most recent person to ask that same question. What is an employer of record? When he was interviewing for his role here at Foxhire Director of Sales. So Matt, when you were interviewing for the role as Director of Sales and you saw Foxhire Employer of Record Service on the job ad, what was your first thought?
My first thought was the same as most employees. What the heck is an employer of record service? So had to do some research there. It's such a different concept than most of us are used to. I mean, in my previous role, I was director of sales at an industrial company. We sold, industrial gases and safety equipment. It was things. It was like products that you could deliver.
Something you could actually touch and see and feel.
Exactly. So it was a little bit different plus this just isn't something you hear about. It's not even like a software that that you're used to or that you would sell.
CRM system. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But what I come to learn that it basically all it is it's one organization that employs a person for another organization. It's kind of, when it all boils down, there's lots of little pieces to it, but that's really all it is we're just hiring somebody and employing them for somebody else for a myriad of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah. That's coming from the director of sales, of course. The simplest answer is always the best answer, of course. And that's true, right? Like just employing people on behalf of other people. That's basically it. And there's reasons why and all that type of stuff. I thought the next question logically that came to my mind is like, well, where did this all come from? Like, employer of record for most people in the business world seems like a new thing, something that's just popping up, right? There's all these new employer of record startups that are growing in Silicon Valley and have a bunch of software and technology, and they're getting all the funding, hundreds of millions of dollars, all that stuff. But it's really not a new thing, though. And so that's why I thought we could go into history of employers of record and where that term comes from. And it takes us sort of back to our founder, Mike Capel. He's a serial entrepreneur, but he founded what is Foxhire today as Top Echelon Contracting back in the very early 90s. And the employer of record market is a cousin of the professional employer market, or professional employment organization, PEO. And both types of organizations were sort of looked at back in the day as the same. And there was a term back then called employee leasing that Mike Capel would talk about. And that was sort of the market that was burgeoning at that time. It would sort of develop. So PEOs, EORs, very similar functional service. Some key differences we'll talk about later, but essentially all that stuff started happening around late 80s, early 90s. And it's the same thing, right? Employing people on behalf of other people, employing employees on behalf of other companies. So that's where it started. And for the employer of record side, it really started in the staffing space. So I know now there's these new use cases, which we'll talk about for hiring international employees, but the employer of record or back office industry started back in the early 90s, and it was basically centered around staffing services, running the payroll and doing the back office tasks for staffing companies, employer of record vendors like Foxhire, like us, Signature Back Office, People 2.0, all started in the early to late 90s and have since grown in that niche market of staffing and recruiting for a while now. So that's sort of where it started. But like I said, like in the past, what do you think, John? Like the last 10 years or so, we've had this like international employer of record.
Yeah, international's definitely come big as of late. I mean, just the term EOR in general, like I was listening to a Stephen A. Smith podcast and he mentioned EOR yesterday. It was like kind of like mentioning independent contractors, but
Stephen A.
ESPN's doing it that way. So it's like
Wow.
I was like, whoa, like we are really into it now when we got mention of that way. So,
Wow.
but yeah, I mean, I think it all kind of goes back to the just like people mass exiting like what normal models of work is and employers having to go out and find the talent that they need to do their jobs. So the EOR is there to help, whether it's domestically or internationally, employ the people that companies need to keep the work going, which is, I think, really important and kind of goes into the international effect as more and more people look to expand outside of the US and, travel different countries and that kind of thing. So, um, employing people is like really hard. That's the other key thing I just wanted to mention. It's like it's hard enough to do in your own state where you're set up in. So to
Right.
have to like manage all different kinds of states and then international countries on top of that, it really difficult. And that's kind of where the EOR can come in because they've been specializing in it in almost all states in many cases for decades, like you mentioned. So they're able to come and kind of make things easier for everybody.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like the future of work and remote work, COVID really drove this new global employer of record use case. So if the first use case is staffing, then the second use case here we're talking about is this like global employment, employing people in multiple countries because now we have remote workers everywhere instead of people in an office, right? Like the future of work has very much so been going into just a distributed model, right? Hiring the best talent no matter where they're at. That's one reason people use employers of record, or reducing costs and hiring people in lower cost localities is another reason, or entering new markets, right? Trying to expand into different countries and wanting to do that without setting up an entity and all the time and investment it takes to do that. The global EOR market has come in to serve that. And that has been accompanied by technology. And so you see companies like Deal and Globalization Partners and Oyster and Foxhire enabling the hire of global employment as well. And so that has sort of been the biggest thing on everybody's mind in the EOR world right now is how these two different use cases are marketed, because the global employment use case is really one everybody thinks about. Like if you ask anybody what's an employer of record in the business world, most of them are going to talk about this global employment model and really forget about or not understand the staffing model that has existed for a very, very long time. So I think it's important to highlight some of those two differences. And really it's about the global market is more so for the most part, full-time employee equivalents that are being hired in a global setting to solve global mobility and a lack of an entity in certain countries, right? Like that's
Well,
basically what they're used for.
and wouldn't you say that grew post-COVID, like, with the whole, people working from home, and then employers are figuring out that their employees aren't nearby anymore. And I feel like the global piece really has taken off in the last few years,
No doubt.
largely due to that. And it's certainly grown in the US as well, with just employees being out of state now. But I just feel like there's a huge growth worldwide because people are working from home, they're working from wherever they want to be, and then they figure out that, hey, actually it's cheaper for me to work in this other country. Can I just, but I'm still doing the work, so why can't I just keep my job? Well,
Yeah.
obviously there's reasons like why somebody can't pay you necessarily if you're working out of country, but there are ways to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, how many, I guess to your point, since you started recently, right? Comparative to John and I, even the last 3 years or so, Matt, that you've been with us,
Right.
I would assume, and you can let me know if I'm wrong, like the amount of inbound leads we've gotten for international opportunities has increased exponentially.
Very much so. And it's not just, I mean, it's certainly increased with US companies wanting to employ in other countries because they have employees who have left the US, but we also get a fair amount of foreign companies wanting to place in the US or elsewhere. But for the same reasons, like they have employees who have left, or maybe they want to start a sales organization in the US and they don't want to actually create an entity. So they just have 1 or 2 people they want to hire. It's much easier and cheaper just to go through an EOR. So we're seeing a lot of that in really both directions.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, and I think you're 100% right. Like the last 3 to 5 years with COVID specifically, obviously we had COVID come in. It drove everybody out of the office. Everybody was remote. And then what happened was people started moving around. So what we hear a lot is like, hey, I have all these employees remotely, but we found out that they're moving or they want to move to this state or that state, and we're not set up in that state. We realize we're sort of out of compliance. We don't really know how to employ in these different states. And we know we have to solve the problem. And EOR could be the solution, right? Certainly they could be their own employer of record, right? Even a staffing firm is technically an employer of record on behalf of their clients if they're not using a back office employer of record like Foxhire. So there are different solutions, but 100% this drive to remote work through COVID drove the interest in EORs exponentially comparative to like the years preceding COVID. No doubt.
I think the other good point, and I learned this at a conference a couple of years ago, and you just keep seeing it come to fruition, is that there's a huge talent shortage everywhere. So companies are going to have to get after the talent wherever they're going. And like you said, because of COVID, they're all over the place. And, you know, we've been lucky enough to go to a couple conferences, and we've kind of discovered over the last year, there's just like this whole other world almost, you know, where it's like all of these remote employees and you're talking with them or like a group and they're like, yeah, I just worked in like Lisbon, Portugal for the summer because it's nice. And then I flew over to Colombia to go work down there for the wintertime because it's nicer there. And it's just like they're just going all over the place. And because there's not enough talent to fill the roles that companies need, they have to find kind of strategic and kind of creative ways to get that talent to work for them. And so they're just going where the talent is. And an EOR can certainly help with a lot of that.
Well, I actually heard it said recently, John, I think it was a podcast I was listening to where they said there's not a shortage of talent. There's a shortage of opportunity. And so the point that they were making is, okay, if you're in any town US and you've got a company and you're only hiring people within driving distance, like that's all you've got. But there are people in other countries who have incredible talent. Think of tech and how many people in Asia, South America even now, like there's so many parts of the country where they are getting extremely good at this, but they don't have the opportunity. So what it offers a company is the opportunity to find, like truly get the best talent worldwide, regardless of where they live, regardless of time zone, regardless of language, sometimes even get the best talent and then retain the best talent as well.
Yep.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, there's no excuses why you can't go find a top-notch developer now.
Oh my gosh.
Because you're located in the Midwest. Like that was always an issue for our companies, right? Like before remote work was really adopted, was like, okay, we only have the best developers in our location, right? But now it's like we can get developers anywhere in the country. We can get the top devs. We don't have, you know, we are based in Ohio. It's not just Ohio. We can go get people from Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston, Miami, doesn't matter. We can have the top people. And I think that's a really cool thing. And that every company is seeing now, you know, like that's, and I think the gig economy is also driving a lot of that too, right? Like Uber and Lyft and those guys kicked off what you would consider the modern gig economy now. But now there's websites you just log on to and you can pick up a job or a gig or a shift in almost any industry, right? Healthcare, IT, marketing, just basic clerical paperwork. It's all shift-based gig work as well. And those companies in some cases are operating as EORs themselves too. And companies are filling the gaps of employment with all those options, right? Full-time employees, gig workers, remote workers, right? There's all these different, what they would call, I guess, total talent management opportunities to get everybody who they need when they need them.
Blended workforce model is what I've heard it called too. It's just like,
Mhm.
you just
Contingent
pick
workforce
one.
management. There's all these different like,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
words, right? Like there's tons of different ones.
Mhm.
But I think you get what we're saying, right? Like there's just
Right.
tons of different opportunities. And because of that, employment through these different opportunities that people are trying to develop and access quickly is difficult to understand quickly if you've never done it before. And that's why the EORs are coming in, whether it be us or whoever, right? And enabling this to happen, right? Enabling what we call it, enabling the future of work, because we believe this is how it's going to be. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. There's a lot of use cases, and there's a lot of specialties too, right? So what's really cool about the EOR industry is there's so many different specialists. Sure, there's the big
Mhm.
guys like Deal and globalization partners and People 2.0 that are like cover a lot of spots. And for the most part, do like one or two industries, whether that be like technology and clerical or just software development. But then you've got other players like us. We're specialists in higher regulated industries like healthcare and education. Certainly do all that other stuff. But I've talked to EORs that cover like events, only events specifically.
Mhm.
So large events, right? And then I've talked to EORs that cover like private
It's like the
equity.
travel. Oh, right. I was just gonna say like the traveling shows too. I
Yep.
know we've talked to some of those as well. Yep.
Yep. And nonprofits for sure. There's a lot of
Mhm.
EORs, or a couple I know of, that only cover nonprofit type deals,
Yep.
opportunities, placements.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's anything that you guys have heard besides those specialties, but those are just some that come to mind.
I think like obviously there's a lot within the healthcare industry that very specific niches for back office and employer of records that do like specific healthcare roles. I think one of the common misconceptions that I always get as I'm talking to people who don't necessarily work with or understand like the EOR model is thinking that it's just IT or just healthcare or something like that. And our years of experience in it have shown that really any industry has this need. It's just maybe
Mhm.
you're not looking in the right places if you are in a certain niche. So, we talk to someone, they're like, oh no, I do accounting, which is a terrible example because there's a tons of accountants that are obviously, brought on through an EOR, but they're like, oh, I'm not going to place anybody through an EOR because it's accounting. And it's like, no, actually, like in our case, 18% of our business is finance and accounting. So it's like, there's so many use cases that the people that think that it doesn't belong in their particular niche probably aren't asking the right questions. And it's leaving like a lot of opportunities out there, especially in the staffing industry, where you could be putting someone on through an EOR and you're just not asking the right questions. So that's the one thing I kind of wanted to highlight is that any industry has it and they get really specific as well. You just have to kind of ask the right questions and then you'll get to the right places.
Yeah, for sure. And that goes for all those direct hire recruiters. I think what you're saying, John, is like that only do direct hire recruitment and they don't offer contract staffing, whether that's through an EOR or if they operate as their own EOR. There is opportunity, and accounting is interesting because there's accountants shortage right now, and so definitely a lot of opportunity there. But yeah, like you said, like that opportunity exists everywhere. Like we've placed all different types of crazy jobs on contract basis that people probably would think like, what is that, right? Like, I don't know if there's any job titles that come to mind for you guys, but I remember we placed what I'd come to know as a docent. That was one of the jobs that we've supported, which is apparently somebody that walks through and shows people around a museum. That's a job title. So I never
Mhm.
knew what that was until we had one of those opportunities, but we could do it, which is cool. So that's what the one job that comes to mind for me. I don't know about you guys.
Trying to think. I know we've had, we've placed in libraries. Again, something you wouldn't really think of before, but we've placed in big libraries. We've been reached out to about personal chefs. I mean, there's just some crazy ones that you just don't, like John said, that you wouldn't think of. Um, but they all have opportunities for an EOR to step in.
I think we've been to dozens of trade shows and
Sure.
conventions,
Mhm.
and like I don't know why it just clicked for me. Like as I was walking through where we were in Charlotte this year, and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these people that are putting on this trade show are probably on a contract through like an EOR, and I'm like, how many times have we just walked by all these people that set up for us? And it's like, that's crazy that there's that many people. It's like a huge business, like you mentioned earlier, Colin, where it's just like everybody is on contract and working through an EOR of some kind. So that's kind
There's
of
a
like
lot more than people think. I met one of my buddies that I went to college with, my buddy Tim, and Tim is sort of a wily character, and he works all the BMX and different types of events in like extreme sports. And so he was getting on a plane, and he had his like jean jacket on with all the different patches. And I'm like, "Oh, Tim, what's up, man?" And he's talking to me, and he's like, I hadn't seen him in like 5 years, something, at least 5 years. And he's like, "So what do you do now?" And I explained what I do. He's like, "Oh," he's like this company. He mentioned one of our competitors. And I was like, "Yeah, exactly like them." He's like, "Oh, that's who pays my paycheck." I'm like, "Oh, really?" So like just this random guy that I was buddies with in college who works these events 100%, like more people than you think are paid through EORs, which I think is really cool in our industry because we're facilitating things that would otherwise not be possible. And I think that's really cool as far as like our ability to impact opportunities for work across the globe. But for us specifically in the United States, I think that's really, really cool.
There's another big one that I don't know why I didn't say earlier, but universities. We work with a ton of universities, and you would think that, oh, well, professors and their staff, they're all going to be paid directly by the university. Well, it turns out they've got adjunct professors in other states, and they don't know if they're being compliant, if they're paying them correctly. I mean, think about if you're in one of the 9 states that doesn't have a state income tax and you've got an employee in a state that does, like that's a different process for you to figure out how to make sure that you're paying those state income taxes. All of that stuff has come up. So that's a big area that we've seen a lot of growth in is universities.
Yeah, no doubt. There's industries that are more willing to accept or adopt the EOR model than others, but I haven't seen an industry that has just totally rejected it at all. Almost every industry we're operating in of some kind. So
COVID certainly forced a lot of people into thinking this way, because that was, we would get a lot of pushback, and now it's like I'm like in the background thinking, haha, look, you had to get it anyway. I know you shot me down a couple of years ago. Now look at us. So that's feels good. But
yes, vindication.
do you know the other thing, and this is transitioning away from our agenda just a touch, but I think it's a great transition point, is when I like you were talking with your friend, talking like, "Oh yeah, I'm employed through your competitor." I get when I explain what we do, "Oh yeah, you guys are a PEO" all the time. And I know, Colin, you went to the PEO conference.
Yes.
What was that? NAPEO?
NAPEO. Great organization. Really enjoyed my time at that event. A lot of awesome people. I think it was 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago in Palm Springs.
Not bad.
And yeah, great learning experience. So, and I think that's a good kickoff point to this question that we get a lot is like, what's the difference? What's the difference between a PEO and an EOR? And we were there on site, and we sort of raised our hand, and everybody's asking, "Where are you from?" The new group that was in this conference, and we said, "We're an employer of record." And there was almost like an audible gasp in the room because of the growth of our space, the PEOs feel that we're very, very similar, and functionally we are, right? And I think the biggest difference that I can highlight for people that are questioning what's the difference between a PEO and an EOR is this concept of co-employment. And so similar to the staffing model, the staffing firm operates as an employer of record. They are the employer of a worker that goes and works on behalf of some other company, right? So they are the sole employer for that employee. Same goes for the employer of record model, right? The employer of record is the sole employer. In the contract, there's no co-employment arrangement. The EOR, similar to a staffing firm, is providing that employee on behalf of or to that client organization. PEO is different. PEO is an understood and contractually obligated co-employment model, recognized legislatively as well as a model that's blessed, I would say, through the U.S. government. And it delineates employment responsibilities between both organizations. And so you're sort of sharing the employment responsibilities. The PEO shares it for things like payroll and insurance and benefits. And then everything else is sort of cast off to the employer, the second employer, which would be the client as an example. So the biggest difference there is that co-employment versus not co-employment. Some other things I would highlight is an EOR typically doesn't employ an entire company's workforce. It's typically some portion of the population of workers, like contract workers or out-of-state remote workers or international workers. It's not typically everybody in the company is employed by an EOR. On the PEO side, that's almost the exact opposite. Usually when somebody works the PEO, they're doing it for their entire company, and they're co-employing everybody to deliver benefits and payroll, so they don't have to do that in-house. So those are two main differences between PEO and EOR from like a functional perspective. And I think the last difference I would highlight is like PEOs, except for some of the biggest ones, Insperity, Paychex, Flex, those guys, it's very regionalized. Like PEOs are very much so mom and pop, smaller. The average PEO is like 10 employees or less in-house and supports clients in like their local region, whether it's one state or 3 or 4 states. There's not many like big national brands. And it's the exact opposite with the EOR model, right? The EOR model is national. The value is every state possible that they cover, every country, the more the better. So a couple of big differences there I'd highlight. I don't know if you guys have anything else there, but that's sort of my PEO EOR rant.
The only thing I wrote down for this was just that, a lot of people use an EOR to try to make like this seamless experience for themselves and their employees. And I think when you get into PEO and it's a little bit of like this co-employment relationship, some of like the seamlessness of it kind of gets torn away a little bit because you are like tugging between 2 different employers at the same time, which is perfectly fine for people that want to retain some of that control. And I think that definitely works for a lot of customers that we do business with, but it does, add extra risk to those people that are going to be part of the co-employment situation, where like a typical EOR model, we're doing all the employer related duties. Like we are handling everything. So like it eliminates a lot of that risk, can kind of make a more seamless transition for some of the employees and the companies that are shifting over to the EOR model. So that's just one thing that that came to my mind as to like co-employment certainly makes things a little cloudier, not for any bad reasons necessarily, but it definitely increases the level of risk and some other possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think, some of the things I would highlight is like shared duties you're talking about. A lot of the PEOs are like bring your own X. So like if I'm a PEO, I could offer PEO services, but as a client, you got to bring your own workers' comp policy. I'm not going to deliver that for you. Or you might bring your own insurance benefits, right? Health insurance benefits. We'll deliver workers' comp, but you got to bring the health benefits component, right? So it's like, what do you want to control and what do you not? A lot of the PEOs will morph and bend to those different needs and requirements of their clients, whereas an EOR is, like you said, going to cover everything.
I'm wondering if we should go, an EOR is going to be more expensive than a PEO. So I'm wondering, we've kind of talked about some of the benefits, but maybe it's a good time to just jump in here and kind of really list. I've got a list pulled up of some of the main benefits for why somebody would choose an EOR.
Yeah.
That might be helpful for our listeners. But I mean, first, one of the big ones is processing and funding payroll. So an EOR actually funds the payroll. So we actually pay and then invoice the client. Depositing and filing taxes, unemployment, workers' compensation, issuing W-2s, collecting and processing timesheets, creating and maintaining employment contracts, employee onboarding, especially in the healthcare field. There's so much, there's such minutia in there of what has to be done to do it correctly. And so that's a huge one as well. Let's see, having the certificate of insurance, completing and storing the I-9 forms, complying with E-Verify, background checks, drug screens, offering and administering benefits, and then terminating employees as well. So, I mean, that's just one list I had. You guys probably have other things you can think of, but I think that kind of shows the difference between the PEO and the EOR. Like there is so much more done by an EOR. And again, there might be times for either one.
No doubt.
But with an EOR, you really are protecting yourself and your company from a lot of those things that can hurt you as an employer.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing to point out, and it's different across use cases, which I think is important. So you mentioned payroll funding is the first thing. So can you talk about the importance of payroll funding to like a staffing firm and how that's sort of different from just a normal like employer that's not a staffing firm?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with a lot of staffing firms, and what they are doing is they are bringing on an employee for a set period of time, typically for a client. So they've got this client out there who needs, let's just say, a programmer. It's a 3-month assignment. What they can do is use us. The person comes on, that programmer comes on our payroll, we pay them, and then we invoice the client. So the recruiter themselves is not taking any money out of their account to pay for the employee. We do that for them, which is a huge benefit. There's a lot of the people we work with are smaller companies who couldn't afford to do that. But since we do that, we also are offering benefits and, you know, things like that to the employees that they just wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that payroll funding component is really important because that's that financial risk, I think, is a lot of the small to mid-sized staffing firms. They're probably getting that payroll funding elsewhere anyways if they're doing their own back office, right? So to have it combined with an EOR service on top is a big thing to consider. Otherwise, you could go get payroll funding from you know, a payroll funding company or a line of credit from a bank or a factoring company who can factor your invoices. There's all these different solutions for this cash flow problem that staffing firms have, but not all employers think about payroll funding because not everybody needs it, right? If you're just a college or university and you're hiring these adjunct professors, like you mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need the payroll funding component, but that is a big component that I think a lot of people overlook for the staffing side, which is in play for EORs and definitely not for PEOs. PEOs want to be pre-funded. So when you work with a PEO, that your money's got to be in their bank account before payrolls run or your employees aren't getting paid. Whereas with an EOR and a staffing relationship, the EOR is paying out 1, 2, 3 weeks of payroll before they ever get paid back. And that's part of the service, and hence why it's a little more expensive. You got to pay for the cost of capital and all that type of stuff. But yeah, big pieces there. I would just summarize, like, lastly, with the EOR PEO thing, a lot of the PEOs are, like I said, regional, and they leverage other companies' technology, right? It's a few accountants, a few HR people, a few clerical people in an office running payroll for a bunch of companies in their area. That's the long and short of it, right? And so they'll use software like QuickBooks or you know, Oracle or Salesforce or whatever the software they select to do the different employment related activities. And you just got to work with whatever it is they have, right? And so if they're bound by Salesforce as an example, then you're as a client bound by Salesforce. And a lot of people are okay with that. A lot of the EORs, though, have their own software that they're delivering that is specifically built for this use case, right? In our case, it's either staffing and recruiting or hiring employees that are out of state or out of country, right? Those two use cases, our software is built for that. And so it's just a different experience. And a lot of the EORs deliver that proprietary software component, you know, us, MyBasePay, Deal, Oyster, all of those guys. Not everybody. So I think that's another thing to consider is, like, when you're signing up with an EOR, you're really getting this employment relationship that sort of feels like we're working with a services firm, but you're getting the software as well. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Because not everybody has that.
And I think sometimes, like you mentioned, PEOs, factoring companies, like the factoring companies do the funding piece. But then you have to, if you want to get the full EOR experience, you then have to go and find someone to do workers' comp and benefits and timesheets and expenses. And by the time you end up building the suite of services that you need while using factoring companies, for example, like hiring one EOR would have been more cost affordable for you to handle all of those situations. So I think like you mentioned, the key part of the technology is that it's all of the employer related duties that you need, and it's going to be all packaged in a software that has all the information that you need for reports and keeping track of your employees and timesheets and all kinds of stuff. So it's that one kind of stop solution for all of your staffing needs that really kind of makes the technology piece really important for people that are trying to figure out what they want to do when they're employing somebody.
Yeah, I would love to ask this question, Matt. Like, I've found in conversations with recruiting and staffing professionals, either recruiting agencies, staffing agencies, there's sort of like a bifurcated mindset. Either you believe that running your own back office is like the goal and the only way to be as profitable as possible. And so therefore you're doing everything you can to get to that place, or you completely reject that and you believe like your time is best spent recruiting and staffing, and therefore I'm going to work with an EOR. Like, there's not really much in between. I don't know if you have heard that, Matt, or
No. Oh, absolutely. No, that is definitely very visible. And but I think what we've seen as being the most successful are the ones who realize that they are salespeople. If you're a recruiter, you're a salesperson. You've got two different sides that you're selling to, between the client and the candidate, but you are a salesperson. And so that's how you make your money. And we've just had a ton of success with the ones who realize that, and they put all their focus on that, because that's how they grow their business. They let us, they let the EOR take care of the behind the scenes stuff, and they just focus 100% on selling and trying to grow their business.
Yep. I love that. And I think you're 100% right. Like, as a former salesperson,
Mhm.
recovering, I also feel that way. Like, my time was best spent on the phone selling, talking to clients. Like, I didn't want to think about anything else, right? And so
Yep.
that's why a lot of people that deal with salespeople deal with like disorganization and, update your CRM and all that stuff, right? All those funny memes come from this idea, like, I want to be selling stuff. That's the best
Right.
use of my time. So
Mhm.
I definitely think there's something there. It's funny because, like you mentioned earlier, we are also operating heavily in the higher education market. And you and I went to the Coupa HR conference. It's the biggest gathering of HR leaders in higher education. And there was a similar mindset I felt in one of the sessions about, they call it multi-state employment in the higher education market. And you could tell there were people that believed in doing it themselves only, like, we've got it handled, we've got it figured out. Like, there's those types of phrases being thrown around. And then there was people that were like really exploring alternative solutions like PEO, EOR, et cetera. So have you seen a similar mindset in higher ed like that I sort of feel like we're seeing as well?
Definitely. And I remember that session too, because one of the somebody from one of the, let's just say an Ivy League school, was very proud that they had taken basically the last 2 or 3 years to get entities in all 50 states. And it had taken them that long. And now they were very proud that they could employ anybody across the US, which is great. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But there definitely is the other side that says, hey, we are located in this state, especially I would say like some of the bigger universities, you see that more of that mentality of like, hey, I want to do it myself. We'll figure it out. We'll get entities in each state, that kind of thing. The small to mid-size universities seem to be more adept at saying, I'm going to stay in my lane here. Maybe we'll do a few states around here where we have multiple employees, but for the rest, we're just going to use an EOR because that's a much better use of our time than going out and trying to get entities set up in all 50 states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's funny to see those differences across the two markets that are totally different.
Oh
I
yeah.
saw that at the PAYO conference we were at too for payroll, the payroll conference, that there is like a sense of pride of like, and they just love crunching numbers. They love setting up everything. They love doing the stuff. I remember one of the keynotes came out and he was like, when it comes to payroll, there aren't many people that have any idea of what you guys actually do. And they all like cheered. And it was like, yeah, because they do it and they do it really well. And they're the ones that are doing the back office and crunching the numbers. And we have a great team that does all that for us too. And yeah, it's certainly could be more cost affordable. Just kind of depend. You just have to run the numbers for yourself and figure out what solution works best for your company.
Yeah. I mean, ER is not the best for everything, right? So don't get us wrong, but yeah, just understanding the different mindsets across the buyer communities that we work with, they're more similar than you would expect. I think that's really, really interesting to see. So, yeah, listen, EOR, we just sort of talked about like everything an EOR could and can be. We certainly didn't talk about all components, nor did we. Hopefully it wasn't a sales pitch. We didn't want that to be the case. Just really wanted to educate people on like, what is this thing? What is this market? I've been in it for 5 years. John, what are you, 9 years in now? Yeah. And Matt, you've been in here for a couple years too. So, we are still trying to wrap our brains around some of the stuff in our market because it's also ever changing. So we hope this was helpful to whoever is listening in. And it is our first podcast, so we'll get better at this. We hope to cover a lot of topics related to staffing, recruiting, employment. And we look forward to, speaking with everybody through this medium consistently every week. We're going to be doing this once a week for the next 52 weeks. And we're really excited to see where that takes us. Hoping to have some guests on, some really smart people, smarter than me, smarter than us in our space to tell us what's going on and just have a conversation about this market because it's ever evolving and it's got some really cool stuff happening. So we are excited to have you guys along for the ride, and we hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right,
Thanks.
guys.
Everybody.
Thanks.